Hi, everybody. Welcome to pre-eval number 6, where we're going to talk a little bit about meaningful methods. And for those of you who are new, my name is Kirsty Keys, and I am here with Janae Gauthier, and we are both students with the Evaluation Capacity Network at the University of Alberta, where we have partnered with the Alberta Mentoring Partnership to offer you this pre-eval series. It's an 8-part series where we are covering introductory information about evaluation. So today we're going to talk about different methods you can use to collect data that's meaningful and useful for you. But I also want to make note of a couple of our last 2 webinars. So pre-eval number 6, 7, and 8 are all very interrelated. And so number 7 is coming up on April 11th, 2022, 12 to 1 p.m. That is a webinar about ethics in evaluation. And so obviously that goes hand in hand with the methods you choose to make sure you're conducting an ethical evaluation. You have to pick ethical methods and ethical ways of collecting data. As well, webinar number 8 is going to talk a little bit about analyzing your data and then mobilizing your findings, translating your findings, sharing them with others. And so obviously, when you pick your methods, one of the considerations we're going to talk about today is, do you have the capacity, the time, the knowledge, the manpower to actually use and mobilize the data that you're doing? So obviously, analysis and knowledge mobilization is going to come into play when you pick your methods. So make sure you tune in for that one. That one is May 9th, 2022. Yeah, so I encourage you to try and watch these last 3 webinars all together. Make sure that you attend all 3 or watch the recordings. And then if this is your first webinar, of course, you can go back to our Moodle site, which I will share a bit of information on how to access. This is our resource website, and you can watch all the previous pre-evals there. Okay, so to get us started, we're going to go over some terms, because I feel like for myself anyways, a lot of these terms I hear thrown around a lot, and I'm not always sure that we all have a shared understanding of the difference between them. So to make sure that we all have a shared understanding of the difference between them, the first term we have here is methodology, then methods and measures, and how I think of it as this sort of funneling down into more of the specifics. So methodology is that set of procedures and activities you use to collect, analyze, and interpret your data. We typically divide this into qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methodologies, but the lines between these are not clear cut, and there may also be other methodologies outside of these sort of 3 major ones, like an Indigenous focused approach. Oftentimes we will consider that as existing outside qualitative, quantitative dichotomy. And so basically methodology is all the things you're doing and how they all work together to lead to your evaluation. Now, methods are the specific things that you do within your study that collect sort of your data, analyze your data, enact your methodology. And then measures are the specific surveys, interviews, focus groups, etc. that you use. So for example, if I have a quantitative methodology and I'm going to want information on numbers, and I decide I'm going to use a survey method, and the specific survey I'm going to use is the BASC-3, for example. That would be how we would break down methodology, methods, measures. Okay, now with that, I am going to pass it over to Janae to talk about data collection, which are the methods that usually fall into qualitative or quantitative, or a combination of both. Each have different qualities and different purposes, and there are strengths associated with both. So I'm going to pass it over to Janae now to talk a little bit about that.
Qualitative methods are usually word-based and descriptive. We are concerned with meaning, so we're looking to understand more about people's lived experiences, and we're attempting to understand their underlying reasons, opinions, and motivations, keeping the context in mind. And when you go to analyze qualitative data, you're typically going to be looking for different patterns and themes that are reoccurring in people's answers. And some of the more popular methods in this category include interviews, which is a one-on-one discussion with someone. And in this method, it can really vary from being very structured and a very structured process where you have a very strict interview guide with very specific questions that you're asking the participant, or it can be more semi-structured where you're having a bit more of an informal conversation with them and there's room to deviate from that interview guide that you created and let the participant guide the conversation a little bit more with what they want to talk about. Focus groups is where you are soliciting direct feedback from a group of people instead of just one-on-one. And usually individuals are building off of other group members' reflections. So everyone's interacting and you're gathering thoughts from multiple people at once. Open-ended questions, this can be used in a survey, and examples could be something like, what are some of the challenges that you faced while participating in the program? How has this program helped you? So it allows participants to really elaborate in a written way. There's also journals where participants or staff can journal their reflections, and it allows for this type of like ongoing reflection. And finally, check-ins, which are just brief meetings with team members or participants to see how everyone is doing and where they're at. And they can be done in an individual or a group setting. The real advantage with qualitative methods is you get that in-depth information. You gather very rich data. It's also useful when you don't know much about a topic, but the downside is it can be harder to analyze and it's time consuming, and it also lacks the breadth, which means it lacks the same range that quantitative methods gives us. So quantitative methods, on the other hand, is very number-based, and we're using counts or statistics. And we're concerned more so with measurement. So we're quantifying people's attitudes, behaviors, opinions with numbers. And our goal is to be precise, objective, and to have measurable data that can be analyzed with statistics later on. So typically, these types of questions are close-ended. So you're looking more at multiple choice, Likert scale style questions. You know, to what extent do you agree with this statement? Write your answers from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And these types of questions don't leave much room for people to elaborate on why they chose the answers that they did. And the most common quantitative methods are surveys. You are collecting data through paper-based or online questionnaires, polls that pop up on Zoom, for example, registration or intake information, which includes participant demographics or the number of people who are using your services, for example, basic intake information. You could also do an observation where you watch program events, meetings, activities related to initiative, and you just reflect upon what you're observing. And at the bottom there, you can also look at your program outputs. So for example, with mentoring organizations, you can look at the number of mentoring matches you had in the past year for your program. So the advantage of quantitative methods is you get that breadth. You can gather data from large populations, and it's usually less time consuming in general, but you do not get that in-depth information that you get with qualitative methods. So you lose some of that context and tone that you get with actual conversations. So some things to keep in mind is that you should always consider who is going to be collecting the information. And there's also benefits to including both qualitative and quantitative methods. Using both types will allow for a really well-rounded perspective and understanding of your program. But of course, cost is always something to keep in mind. It's not always possible to use both. And later on, we're going to get into arts-based methods with our guest speaker. So you'll get a bit of a different perspective on methods later on too. So we all know that sometimes you don't always get to choose your methods, and sometimes your funders are really strict with what types of methods that they want you to use. So how can you still make them meaningful and useful for you? So the number one thing that's important is to always keep in mind your evaluation purpose and your evaluation questions, which we did touch on a few webinars ago. Just a quick reminder that your purpose is the reason that you're doing your evaluation, and your evaluation questions are the things that you want answered to achieve that purpose. So if we compare it to writing a paper, your evaluation purpose is like your big title, and your evaluation questions are those subtitles. So your methods are going to be the bulk of your paper and all the writing that's underneath each of those subtitles. that allows you to answer those main evaluation questions. So it's important to continue looking back on your purpose and main evaluation questions while you're deciding on which methods to use, or while creating your data collection tools like an interview guide or a survey, because that's what's going to dictate what kind of specific survey questions you're going to ask. So in all, every piece of your evaluation should be connected and there should be a flow. So your purpose informs your evaluation questions, and then that informs what methods you use and how you go about creating those data collection tools. And like I said, the whole point of your evaluation is to address that purpose in the main evaluation questions. So you should constantly be coming back to them, and it's a very iterative process. It's also really important to keep in mind the resources and knowledge and skills that you, your stakeholders, or participants have. Sometimes the best method to answer your evaluation questions just aren't feasible when you don't have the knowledge or skills or time to execute them. And Kirsty's going to touch on that a bit later on. So yeah, it's important to weigh the pros and cons of each method and to consider your resources, your knowledge and skills, but also your participant capacity.
Okay, so let's go into a little bit more detail about each of these sort of areas. So evaluation, purpose, and questions. I think Janae gave a really great reminder for those of you maybe too who haven't been to our previous evaluation webinars. We encourage you to go back and watch that. But here's an example of an evaluation plan that was created in UEval. We've talked a little bit about UEval before. This is the course that we offer. It's the 1-week intensive course where students learn how to do evaluation plans, and they support a community organization doing that. And we had Rochelle, who maybe you've met in our first pre-eval webinar. She was a student and she helped create this evaluation plan for the Boys and Girls Club, and specifically Big Brothers Big Sisters Edmonton. And you can see here how they really lined up their purpose, their questions, and then their methods all kind of flow together. So remembering that your methods are intended to help you answer your questions and fulfill your purpose, you'll need to remind yourself when every time you have a method, will this actually help me answer my evaluation questions? Because oftentimes, if you're like me, there's lots of things that you want to know and that are nice to know, right? But we don't always have the capacity or the time or the resources to have all the nice to knows and want to knows. And so really trying to line them up can really help you narrow down, out of all the things that you think you would like to collect data on, what am I really going to focus in on in this particular evaluation? So that goes back to that narrowing of the scope, right? So in this example, their purpose of the evaluation was to understand the effectiveness of virtual mentoring activities for children and youth in order to make decisions about continued delivery, feasibility, and sustainability. And so that first question that was going to help them achieve that purpose was, what is facilitating engagement in a virtual space and what is challenging that engagement? And to answer that, they came up with some questions asking about mentorship outcomes and virtual service delivery, and they put those together in a survey. Following that, we have the next question here: which elements of virtual mentoring are successful and which are required for improvements? And what have we learned? What works? What needs to be changed? And so for that, the surveys gave them a good idea of what needs to be changed and improved based on what was hindering and facilitating virtual mentoring. So it kind of flowed nicely from the surveys were able to help them answer the first and second question. Based on the responses from the survey, what they decided to do was have focus groups. And that was aimed to get at the lived experiences of participants and understand why people were giving certain responses, such as rating virtual mentoring as a 1 out of 5 in terms of their acceptability of it. What they could then do is they could bring all those people together and ask some follow-up questions. And they didn't even have to bring everybody together. I think that you could bring a few select people who maybe everybody who said a 1 out of 5, or everybody who said a 5 out of 5, or some who said 1, some who said 5. Because we don't always have the capacity to have 8 focus groups, right? So we want to be selective in terms of how we're using our resources. And so by looking at the survey data, they were able to narrow down and make their focus groups more feasible to answer the second question here. And then the last one is virtual mentoring feasible resource-wise. They use data from the above sources, and then they also did check-ins with external stakeholders and participants. So that's kind of that space that Janae talked a little bit about, where you're coming in, you're doing a brief little, how is this going for you? What's going on? And you're doing those every so often throughout the process. And then over time, you're seeing all together, are these check-in data telling me? Something else that can be really helpful is looking back at your logic model. And if the methods you're using don't somehow relate to your logic model, you might want to consider, am I on the mark? Am I off the mark? Is this really going to help me answer my evaluation questions? So you can do sort of this flow thing that we've got here, and you can actually add your logic model to this sort of outline, tie things in. Okay, so that's our evaluation purpose and questions. Moving on to resources. At this point, the main question you're asking yourself is, do I have the resources and capacity to not only collect the data, but also to store it, to analyze it, to interpret it? Resources are a huge piece of the puzzle, and immediately we think money, right? Money to buy the survey, money to buy the program to send the survey out, money to rent a room for interviews. The nice thing about methods is you have lots of options, so you can choose one that is financially feasible. And especially now with our heightened virtual world, a lot of these things, these costs can be reduced, right? You can buy a SurveyMonkey subscription instead of having to print 20 paper surveys and send them out in the mail, right? You can hold a focus group over Zoom instead of having to find a space to do that. So there are ways to now get a little bit more creative financially with our methods. But some other resources you want to consider are time, manpower, and storage. So do you have someone with the time and knowledge, for example, to analyze your interview data? How many interviews can I actually hold within this time frame? Do I have staff to then transcribe these interviews and analyze them? And what technology will I need? So Jason tells a really great example of an organization he worked with that was collecting years of open-ended question data, and they just kind of had it all stored away. And every survey, they'd have these open-ended questions, those questions where, you type in your long response in the box. And this type of data takes time to analyze, and the organization just didn't have that time. And so he made the point that they should probably just stop collecting it, right? It's great that they had that, but because you didn't have the time or manpower to then make sense of that data, really what you're doing is you're investing your own time and participants' time without any benefit from that data. So those are some things to consider. And it's also okay to know that you can pare down your methods to be just enough to answer your evaluation questions if that's what you have the resources for. Don't overdo it. Don't overthink it. Don't make it into a massive project that you just won't be able to accomplish, because that's not going to be meaningful for you. All right, some other examples would be open-ended questions. Will you have the staff and time to analyze and interpret all those responses? Photo voice, do your participants have access to cameras, and can you provide them? We'll get into a little bit of what photo voice is in a bit. I think we'll talk a little bit about that in our arts-based methods. But also don't forget about your pre-existing data. So some of the data you've collected previously or that you're already collecting can be used to help you answer some of your questions. So for example, meeting minutes and financial documents could be used in questions around program feasibility. Length of matches, number of participants, demographic data, required questionnaires from funders. You don't have to make up brand new methods to answer your evaluation questions. You can use things you already have. All right, moving along into participant capacity. So I touched on this a little bit in terms of time, but another important consideration is, do your participants have the capacity to engage with and respond to your data collection methods? So if you're developing a survey that's long and time consuming, most people aren't going to have the capacity in terms of their time and energy to do the survey. If you think about the last 2 years, how many surveys people have been doing about their responses to COVID and how they're managing virtually. I don't know about you, but I've gotten so many emails asking for my opinion about virtual services from all the different groups I'm involved in. And what do? I often delete them because there are so many, right? So when you're choosing your methods, you really have to consider your participants' capacity and what will be the best way to reach them with that capacity. So let's go over a few of the things to consider that can get in the way of responding. So first of all, time. People are busy, often overscheduled right now with hopping from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting. You're doing this over your lunch break. So we don't always have a lot of free time to go ahead and do some of these methods. So we really have to consider time when asking people to participate in data collection. Usually participants are more willing to provide their time for things they find more meaningful and important, which I'll get to in a second here. But generally you want to ensure you're limiting the time you're asking for from participants while still getting the best data you can. So it's really finding that balance. Some things you can do as mentoring organizations that can help might be something like holding an information session for all your mentees and their parents, and then saving the last 10 minutes for them to do the survey, building it into something that's already happening so you're not asking for more of their time, right? Having mentors and mentees draw a picture and write a couple sentences about their match during a scheduled match time if they have times that they meet. What I did for eval, which was, we talked about, that was the a couple month long learning course, the extended, more in-depth version of pre-eval, was we held short focus groups with all the learners at the end of the session. So we saved the last 15 minutes and everyone who was participating in the evaluation would join into the focus group and we would just have a conversation. So where you can, you're trying to embed data collection into your activities. That will oftentimes help with engaging participants and saving them time. Clarity of the questions you're asking. So you want to consider things like reading level, aiming for grade 5, usually is a good rule of thumb. Things like jargon. Are you using words that most people probably won't know because they're not within your organization? Are there organization specific terms you're using? Double barrel questions. So asking things with 2 parts. Do you like oranges and grapes? That's going to be hard for some people to answer because they might like oranges, but not grapes. So considering breaking things down as much as you can when you're developing the questions that you're going to be asking people will really help. And also giving it to somebody to look at, getting another set of eyes will be helpful as well. Perceived benefit of participating. So do participants see the benefit of giving their thoughts and opinions? Maybe they find the activity really meaningful. Arts-based methods can help with that oftentimes. Do they trust you to actually listen to and use what they have said to you? Do you have that rapport with them where they think that if I invest my time to give my opinion, I think this will affect what this program is doing and help improve it? This is where involving your potential participants as stakeholders can come in handy. So we talked a little bit about steering committees. Those are the committees that involve stakeholders from which are people, again, reminder, these are people who have a vested interest in your program and your evaluation. So maybe you consider having a mentor and a mentee perspective by inviting parents and mentors onto your steering committee so that they can help give that opinion to you about is this a meaningful activity for people? Are they going to want to participate? And lastly, can they report on what you're asking? Do they have the experience? We're probably not going to be asking a mentee if the program was financially feasible. They probably can't tell you much about that. But are they also able to put words to thoughts? Like, are they able to rate something on a 1 to 5 scale, or is it more complex than that? Do they have difficulty expressing it in the realm that you've given? If I'm going to ask them a really broad question and I'm going to give them a 2-sentence space on my survey to answer that, perhaps they're just not going to engage, or they're not going to give me the full story, right? I'm going to miss out on something rich there possibly. So being mindful of that. Something else, are these sensitive questions your participants are not comfortable sharing in the format you've chosen, right? You might have certain questions that make more sense to ask in a survey format rather than a focus group because this is a sensitive topic. So these are all things to consider when you're thinking about participant capacity. Okay, moving into single time point data collection. From my experiences, This is something that I find comes up. One of the most frequent questions that I will get from people is this single time point data collection, because we've talked about the importance of planning your evaluation as soon as you can when you start implementing your program. When you do this, you can plan for pre-post data collection. So that's when you collect data before the program starts, and then after the program is done, or at least the time period during which you're doing your evaluation has finished. So you can also collect midpoint data as well. What this allows you to do is to see any change from before and after the program occurred. You can't necessarily say the program caused the change, but you can see any change that happened while the program was running, right? But like the photo here, things happen. What we expect to do and what actually happens doesn't always go hand in hand. Oftentimes we just don't have pre-data. We didn't have the time to plan the evaluation beforehand, or what we thought we wanted to evaluate isn't actually what we wanted to evaluate. So whatever it might be, we don't have the data, it's not there. So what can be done about that? You can start collecting data at the midpoint and do like a mid-post comparison, or you can do a post-only data collection, so also called a single time point data collection. And you can still answer your evaluation questions this way. So the first thing that can be done is choosing evaluation questions that are not change or growth focused. So you might ask something like, what are participants' mental well-being after participating in our mentoring program? There's nothing in that question that I need pre-data for, right? I don't need a survey from before the program started to be able to answer that evaluation question. Another thing you can do, though, if you do have change-oriented questions like, did participants' mental well-being improve after participating in our mentoring program, is you can ask participants to reflect back. So, for example, do you feel like your mental well-being has improved from before you started the mentoring program? Or a survey question. My mental well-being has improved since starting the program. Strongly disagree to strongly agree. So you can see that you can still try and get at some of that change, some of that growth over time. You won't have maybe the same rigor that you would with a pre-post data collection, but if you need that growth, and oftentimes we do, we want to provide that information to funders about what is happening for participants while they're going through our program. This is one way you can get at that if you didn't plan and have that pre-data before for whatever reason. And so I have an example here to show you of a something like this that Jason helped develop the survey. It was for Faculty of Extension graduate students. And so what you can see here is they're getting a little bit at things that happen after, pardon me, things that happen after the program. So I have been able to apply the skills or knowledge learned in this program in my professional life. So it's reflecting back on what they learned in the program to now and how that's applicable, right? The knowledge and skills I learned in this program helped me to gain employment. I have been able to apply it to my professional life. Well, they have that question in there twice. I think this was a draft survey, but what you can see here is they're asking questions that they don't need pre-data for, right? They're still asking about the impact of the program without having to have that pre-data. So those are some things to consider, really thinking about what you are asking in your evaluation questions and how you can format your survey questions to still get at that pre-post sort of stuff if you need to. Okay. So moving into surveys in a little bit more detail, just because this is oftentimes something people will use frequently. The reason for this is usually surveys are a feasible resource-wise way to collect data. And people, your participants are familiar with surveys, right? And so oftentimes that's what programs will find useful. So a pre-existing survey is nice, right? If you can find one, because you don't have to develop any questions, and you might find one that's shown by researchers. It has a good backing for its use, right? So when you're able to, that's great. But sometimes those surveys are expensive, or they're too long. They're asking questions that you actually don't need the answers to. You'll need some of those questions, or there just isn't a survey to get at what you want to know. So one of the things you can do is you can develop your own survey that's specific to what you need to know. I touched a little bit on this, but you want to make sure you're not giving your participants some survey burnout, right? You don't want to over survey them, and you don't want to make your survey too long. One highlight for surveys in particular is open-ended questions. Now, open-ended questions are kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, if you use only closed-ended questions, you have the potential to miss out on some really rich data and more in-depth information, depending on what you're asking and what you're doing. But on the other hand, the more open-ended questions you use, the more you might dissuade people from responding, because they take more time and thought to fill in. So you need to be strategic in how you use open-ended questions. So for example, if you stick 5 open-ended questions at the end of your survey, which oftentimes people do, that is often my gut instinct too, is to put my open-ended questions, I'm going to put them at the end of the survey, right? Because I'm just going to put all my closed-ended ones on one page, and then they're going to click next, and boom, there are the open-ended ones. But if you think about it, if I click next and I've got 5 big boxes on my screen, I'm like, oh my gosh, I thought I was 50% done this survey, and it turns out that I've got to now type in 5 paragraphs, right? And so if you put them at the end and they're all on one page, you might get no response to any of them. That's oftentimes what we see. Or you might get like 1 sentence for each one. On the flip side, if you put your open-ended questions at the start, people might just exit out of the survey, right? So some strategies that can be helpful is asking a closed-ended questions like rate your satisfaction 1 to 5, and then follow that up with your open-ended question. So it's a little bit more dispersed throughout the survey. Asking something like, please explain your answer. Try to not put all your open-ended questions on one page. If you can break it up visually for people, sometimes that's helpful. And even putting parameters in your open-ended questions can be helpful. Like write 1 or 2 sentences explaining why you chose that answer. It can feel a lot less overwhelming for people. And if they want to write more, they can, right? There's nothing on that limiting them technically, but sometimes that just helps them feel a little bit less pressure to give you these really long answers. So if you do want help in choosing or even developing a survey, consider coaching, which again, I'll get to that at the end here about how you can access that. But also in the coming weeks, I'm going to be adding a large dump of resources on the Moodle website about methods and data collection. So keep an eye out for that. And then, yeah, the last thing before we pass it over to our guest speaker is analysis and knowledge mobilization. So I talked about this. This ties in really well with methods, because you need to know if you can analyze the data, how to do it, what data analysis and collection will support different knowledge mobilization. So you're going to want to tune in to pre-eval number 8 on May 9th for that. If you haven't registered already, you can do that on the AMP website. Okay. So we're a little bit ahead of time. So I wonder if Michelle is here, or if she's stepped away from her computer. And if you have,
I'm here, I'm ready to go.
Awesome. Okay, so let me stop my sharing here. So Dr. Michelle Searle, she is an assistant professor and researcher at Queen's University, and she's also one of the co-investigators at the Evaluation Capacity Network. She has received the Credentialed Evaluator designation from the Canadian Evaluation Society, and she's also a member of the Ontario College of Teachers. Her research really focuses on the usefulness of program evaluation, forms of knowledge generation and dissemination, and she's guided by 2 decades of experiences as an educator in international and local contexts. And I personally consider her as my arts-based methods guru. And so given that arts-based methods, often I find they're of high interest with the people I've worked with in building capacity at AMP, we thought it'd be a treat to have Michelle speak to you a little bit about these techniques. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Michelle. And I think you should be able, if you need to share your screen, you should be able to.
Great. I will do that. Okay. Can you see the slide that I'm putting up?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm trying to figure out how to move into presenter mode, but my thing is blocked. How's that? Good? Super. Thank you so much for that introduction, not just about me, but also this whole introduction that you've given us about methods today. It's concrete practical examples really helpful for framing how we think about methods. So for the next little bit of time, I'm just going to talk about how I've used some artful methods in program evaluation. And I go back and forth with the language I use about this because the arts sometimes has different connotations around, elitism and who's an artist and who isn't. And when I'm using the arts and artful methods in program evaluation, it's not for me about the quality of the art. It's about the artful processes as ways of engaging stakeholders, as a way of accessing program experiences that might otherwise be difficult to articulate or hard to access. So that's the kind of work that we're going to talk about today. And I am joining you today. Well, actually, I'm not joining you from Kingston today. I'm joining you from Mexico. But normally, I am joining you from Kingston, which is the land of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. And I'm really privileged to be working at Queen's University, and I'm really grateful to be able to live and work there. And as the pandemic hopefully is winding down in Canada, I'm also glad to be able to leave there and go somewhere warmer for a little bit of time, which is what I'm doing right now. So I started to experiment with the arts a little bit because my background is in the arts, as an arts educator. And interestingly, my background is actually in the performing arts, dance and drama and music. But the kind of arts that I use the most when I'm working as an evaluator are actually the visual arts, which I was reflecting on that a while ago. And I was thinking, why is that? But I think if I ask people to improvise or dance a particular experience, that can feel really threatening. And one of the things about using the arts in evaluation is to find ways that it enhances the accessibility to evaluation opportunities, not further prohibits them. And so people are very fluent working with images, right? We read images all the time in advertisements and magazines. So asking people to look at images or to collage images doesn't feel quite as threatening as some other art forms. And so often when I'm working with groups, I try to start with really accessible art forms, and then we might scale them in different ways depending on the group and of course the purpose of the evaluation. So I thought one way to begin today would be to just ask everyone, if you have a sticky note or a scrap of paper nearby, what is a shape or symbol that you would draw as you're just beginning this thinking process with me about the idea of art in evaluation? And I love heads. I love the thought of what goes on in all of our heads. I'm doing my own right here because my dad, he owned a variety store, and he used to always say, never ask anyone to do something that you won't do yourself. So I'll show you mine. The camera's on, you can see it there. So if I had a sticky note here, this is what you'd see. My head, it's kind of exploding with the ideas of possibilities and creativity. And there's these hearts in here, because I think what the arts do for me is that they provide a place for relationships, a place for connections, a place for embodiment, right? Connecting the way our heart and head feels with the experiences that we have. And so when I'm working with groups and I might ask them to do an activity just like this, then I would also ask them to explain it to one another, explain it to me, and then I'd ask them to title it. I very rarely would use the arts and evaluation as a standalone. I often pair the arts with other more traditional forms of data capture, like you heard about today, interviews, focus groups. And I find that titling a piece of artwork or having to discuss it is a way of extrapolating ideas, but it's also a way of compressing how we think about things. So these are just some of the many forms that we can consider as evaluators when we're thinking about arts. And the form is certainly something we have to consider, right? Like, is the evaluation context that we're working in appropriate for using digital forms, for using theatrical forms. For example, some of the projects I've worked in, craft was a very appropriate form. I'm thinking of an Indigenous project that we worked on where we did quilt making, and different participants were crafting their own squares using multiple kinds of materials, and then we sewed it together as a representation of our community experience. So any of these forms can be accessible as a way of thinking about it. And I want to just very quickly give you a few examples of how I've used artful forms in my evaluation. So this was a project where we were investigating a program in schools to reduce violence. And we wanted to talk with children about their experiences, but without potentially inflicting more harm, which the program was seeking to address. And so we had children in the grade 4 to 6 ages, which in Ontario would be about maybe 9 through 12-year-olds. We had them draw pictures of their experience of the program as it was being enacted, implemented in the classrooms. And then in small groups, they were working with us in the hall, and we were essentially having focus groups to use their drawings as a talking point, right? So we were basically, you construct the image and then we use the image to elicit your programmatic experiences. And that could tell us a lot about the way that the children perceived the program as operating, that was accessible to them and to their understanding. In the other digital image, what you see is a very similar process as well, only we were working with more senior students, grade 7, 8, and 9 students, which would be children 13 through 15. And they were using the graphical and digital arts as a way to convey what they believed were the core programmatic values and how they influenced their school community. So for each of those contexts, we had an overarching evaluation question that our collaborator was seeking to answer. And then we had a series of enabling questions that the different age groups were looking to address with this data capture. Here's another example of an artful practice that I use. This is an image elicitation. So this time, instead of having the participants creating the images, as the previous one showed you, what you see are the images are all cut out of books. They're glued onto cardstock and then they're laid out along the tables. This is really a difficult process for me because I love books and cutting them up just about breaks my heart. However, I found that this was, as a person starting out in my research career, this was a really affordable way to get image decks. You can also buy image decks online. There's a board game called Dixit. They've got great images. You can just buy the board game and use their cards. But this is the way that I started doing it. And I had different image decks for different groups. This is a mixed deck. You can see there's some black and white images. There's some more childlike images. I was working in this case in an education landscape. Sometimes I've worked with a religious education program that we have. And so I used a slightly different deck for that. Sometimes I use just the black and white images when I'm working with adults. So I can kind of feather the deck depending on who I'm working with. And I try to lay out about 3 or 4 images per person. So if I have a group of 30 people, then I'm going to have to put out about 90 images so that there's enough variety for people to choose. But I also give instructions at the beginning, like, try to find an image that speaks to you. It's okay if more than one person chooses the same image. It's okay if we read images differently. 2 people will pick the same image, but read very different things into what that image has to say. I also try to make sure there's some blank cards out, or tell them that they can just turn it over and project their own image from their mind onto it. It doesn't have to be one that I've laid out. And I'd also never use an image and collect data off the first question. It requires a little bit of training and practice to gather some fluidity with how to work with images to collect data. So I might first have a group just get going and say, find an image that helps us think about how you're feeling today, or how you're feeling about participating in this evaluation. And we might talk through that. And then I would move on from there to ask some more focused questions that related back to the evaluation questions that tease out some of the aspects of the logic model. In this case, we were looking at fidelity to implementation of a particular program. We knew anecdotally that some of our program implementers were getting stopped before they could complete the whole course of the program. We wanted to understand why that was happening. And so we used the images to get our participants to talk about their programmatic experiences. And what was really neat when we were doing this is that they were telling each other stories, and through the stories they were telling with the images, it was almost like a bit of an intervention because they were helping to problem solve with one another. So we were getting data that we needed about fidelity for implementation, but they were getting some problem solving solutions to help overcome the hurdles in their program spaces. So that was kind of a neat way to do that. And to go along with this, I have a template that on the back, each image is numbered. So they would record the number. They would take notes on what other people in their group were saying. This was, I mean, it was co-facilitated with the program implementers, myself as the evaluation researcher, and also the participants had a role in note-taking. We also had audio recording on the table that we could then go back later and try to marry conversations and images all together. As you can see on the one side where there's the hot pink sticky notes, that's me trying to cluster the images along the thematic lines as we start to code and analyze the images. So I put these three images together very intentionally because I think sometimes the arts in evaluation or in research, it feels like a little bit of a black box, right? You're like, okay, well, we do all this fun art stuff and then what happens? What do we do with all that? Well, for me, I find it's very similar to working with other forms of qualitative data. So the processes are iterative, they are layered, they are nuanced, right? My coding process often has a 3-phase cycle that I work through with the data. So on the one side, you see all these folded poems. That's a collaborative poetic activity that I use. And at the end, I'm going to give you a web address that has instructions for all these activities and the templates that I use if you want to use them. You'll see that I do this collaborative writing thing. And I've taken the evaluation question, I've broken it down into a series of prompts, and then people are writing and they're passing the poems, and then they read their poems out to each other. And sometimes we construct little mini poems from the big poems. And sometimes we perform them for the whole group, which sometimes involves feather boas and guitars. So the poetry and the data collection is almost an extension of the program itself, in that they become very complementary in terms of building relationship, expression, group cohesion, understanding one another's roles and responsibilities. And then we take all that data away and we do something really sort of standard. You see that Excel file at the top with all those blue categories. That's us entering the data from all that poetic. You know, and I don't love that process because it feels sometimes like we're being a bit reductionist, stripping it down to line by line. But we need to do that to sort all the data so that we can then look at the data in a different way. And then what you can see below is now we've actually printed out portions of the data and taken them back to our collaborators and said, here's some of the stuff that's resonating along the thematic lines of the questions you have. What do you see here? And then we get them to sort them out. And in this case, they happen to produce these sort of shape pieces. And then from the shape pieces, we have a discussion where often we're using a very large whiteboard or, you know, butcher block paper, and we're mapping out what people are saying, because the people that we're working with, they know the program so much differently than we do as external evaluators coming in. So I wanted to kind of make that arc a little visible. And this next slide does something very similar, I hope. It shows you, on the one side, you see a graffiti wall. This was students. We were trying to understand a distributed leadership process. We wanted students to help us understand how better to reach them with evaluation and research findings, which, you know, they were not getting. And I heard you talking earlier about how many surveys we all get. The students were like, you know, we don't want to do any more surveys. We were having survey fatigue. They weren't calling it that, but that's what they were experiencing. So we said, well, then help us understand, how can we better communicate? And that's what they're mapping on this big graffiti wall. And we were facilitating it as evaluators, and they would put things up and we would ask them questions about what they were putting up there. Why do you say this? What does that mean? What would that look like? Again, we took the data home and we used a theming and patterning process, which you see in the middle. But then, because of something that happened during the data gathering process, we wanted to make sure that we represented the findings in a way that we could send them back, close that feedback loop with the students who participated. So we did the infographic, which you can see on the side there. We wanted to send them back because we were hearing them say, we're tired of giving you information and we never hear back from you. So we wanted to make sure that we were closing that feedback loop. And we also wanted something really visible, because at the end of the day, when they were making that graffiti wall, many of the students were standing in front of the wall and they were holding up their selfie, their phones. They were taking selfies of themselves with the wall behind them. And then they were emailing the research department. They were saying, hey, can you send us some of those materials? Can you send us the instructions? We want to do this with students at our schools so we can find out X, Y, or Z, right? So we wanted to send them this graffiti wall, partly to summarize the findings, but also as a way to activate their capacity to do this sort of a data gathering experience in their schools. And I think what's really important when you're working with the arts, and I use a particular form of arts research called arts informed, is that we're not just using all these artful processes when we're generating data, but we also find ways to bring them into representing the data, right? I mean, how many times do we hear beautiful stories, or we take photos, or we make things, but then it makes it like one line in the report, I want it to be more than that in my work. And so that's why you'll see an example of me trying to do that. I think I'm getting better, but this is an old one. You'll see that picture of a head with the yellow. So that was a piece of art that was created by one of the program trainers in this particular report. And I used it as a way to summarize those key learnings, which is essentially the executive summary of the report. And on the other side, you'll see in the background a faded out image of the collaborative poetry with a poem that we created using the verbatim voices of program trainers to epitomize the experience. And what was really interesting, I went back about 6 months after we finished the evaluation, is that some of the key decision makers who fund these programs, who decide about the lifespan of the programs, they were telling me that the poems and the images, they were what stood out for them the most, because they sounded like and looked like and felt like they knew the experience to be. So there was a sense of trustworthiness that came from having the narrative hanging beside the poetic, hanging beside the artwork. And I think that's, as an evaluator, what I'm looking for when I'm reporting. I'm looking for ways to crystallize, of course, and respond to the evaluation questions, but also to create an experience for the reader, ideally an educative experience. So this is the website that I was telling you about. I haven't been watching my time at all, but I think I'm okay still. Am I okay, Christy? Okay. This is the website that I was telling you about. And what you'll see there is data collection approaches, and all of these and other artful approaches that I've been experimenting with are available there. There's some research. It's a little bit old now, but if you want to go there, it's all open. You can help yourself. And I also wanted to recommend a few books, because I find evaluation is quite a book field. I feel as an arts researcher and an evaluator that when we got the handbook of the arts and qualitative research, which was in about the mid 2000s, that we'd really made it as a field. It was like, we have a handbook, we exist. But handbooks are very expensive. And so some of these are other less expensive books that I would recommend. Method Meets Arts, Researching Children's Experiences. These all have really practical examples of ways that you could bring artful techniques in. If you want to think about how can we create an experience for participants that might look different than some of our traditional ways of data gathering, and how might it complement some of those traditional? And these are just some other examples, because what you'll see is that the arts in research and evaluation is a little bit like an umbrella, and it's very colorful and it's very diverse. And so, for example, we've got art in social settings, arts for social justice, expressive arts, arts-based, arts-informed, artography, narrative inquiry. You know, just like we heard about qualitative and quantitative today, there's all sorts of variety within the arts. And as an evaluator, as a methodologist, you pick and choose what fits a little bit eclectically, right? And you weave it all together and you fit it together to advance the questions that people care about that you're working with. And so I would close by thinking about this. If you have to caption this photo to describe your reaction to the idea of the art as a method for evaluation in your context, how would you caption this photo? And I invite you to use the chat to do that. And I'm going to pull up the chat so I can see it. Thank you, Christy. That's lovely for putting the thing in. And I just welcome any questions that we have in our few minutes that remain. And thank you for letting me talk about this thing that I love about.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed listening to that and listening to you talk. And hopefully people are thinking of a caption and posting it in the chat here. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We can do what with art?
Yes, that's not an uncommon reaction. So thank you to the two of you who threw something out. I remember going into a school district when I was working on my dissertation. I said, you know, this is the kind of thing I'm looking to explore. I'm doing research on if arts can be useful in evaluation. And at the university I graduated from at Queen's, you had to do very traditional statistical training and qualitative training. And then I also did this artful training. And I remember someone saying to me, what's your backup plan? Like, are you sure you can actually do a project that way? Yeah, I am actually. I am sure now. I have evidence about that, but thank you. I like the idea that there are lots of options. There really are. I mean, for any kind of data gathering, right?
For sure. Yeah, no, that's a great point. Like there's just so many different ways you can turn there. Anything really can be data, but the question is whether you can make that data also meaningful for other people, right? And I think art is a great way to do that. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing with us. Really quickly before we are out of time here, I'm just going to post here the Moodle website. So for those of you who've gone here and have maybe had trouble figuring out how to actually access the content, we have now a step-by-step video. And the references and texts will be available on this recording. You'll be able to pause. We make this webinar into a video. And if you go to the website, the Moodle website, that's where you'll be able to find the recording. So if you would like to access those, you will be able to do so there. But yeah, if you've had trouble accessing the content, we recognize it wasn't the easiest to use before. So at the front end now, when you click there, it will have a video walking you through how to actually get to the content. So just watch that little 2-minute video and hopefully that will help. As well, if this is your first time joining us, after I've just talked to you so much about survey fatigue, I have a survey. So if this is your first time joining us, if you don't mind taking 5 minutes to fill out our survey, this is the link. This is just so that we can evaluate actually the pre-eval webinar. It's very meta, and make sure that we are improving how we offer these these webinars to you. And then last but not least, I've also talked, oh, thank you, Michelle. And Michelle shared the link for the Google Slides as well. And last but not least, I've talked about coaching. If you would like to access coaching, individual coaching about any of these topics or anything evaluation related, whether it's a question that you have, whether it's planning your evaluation, whether it's analyzing data, anything under the sun, you can access individualized coaching by going to the Moodle site, and there's a link to sign up at the top there. Okay, I think that's everything. I'm not seeing any questions. If you do have questions, this is my email. I've shared it with people on a few occasions now, but in case you don't have it, there it is. Please feel free to reach out with any questions whatsoever. And yeah, thanks again, Michelle, for joining us and for sharing this. Moodle site. So the Moodle site is an online resource hub, basically. It's a place where you can access resources. There's discussion boards where, for example, if you're looking for a specific survey about mentoring, you could pop it in the discussion board and see if anybody else on the website has an idea. Or if you have questions, comments, things you've tried that worked really well, you can pop them there. And then, yeah, you can also access the previous pre-eval recordings, as well as any future ones we'll do, and links to coaching. So that is basically our hub for accessing anything related to this evaluation capacity building. Okay, yeah, any questions, please feel free. Yeah, thanks guys, take care. Thanks so much.